it's very rewarding to raise your own queens. Another situation you can run into this time of year is it's called pollen bound or honey bound. This is a pollen bound frame. If you've got a failing queen and you've got a pollen flow like we had in the past before this rainy spell happened, the fruit trees were starting to bloom, the dandelions were blooming, and the trees were putting their catkins out, which produce profuse pollen quantities. So if you don't have a queen that's laying and filling up the cells with eggs, they're going to fill it up with pollen or nectar, and it's called being pollen bound. It's a real problem because it's too much resource, basically. That's something to watch for as well. Right there, that's a frame. That's a beautiful frame of honey, but again, they can be pollen bound with syrup or with honey. If you're feeding them too much syrup and the queen's not laying and they're not raising brood to use these resources, you can actually stifle them, and she'll run out of spaces to lay when she kicks in laying. And it can slow down the process of having this maximum population when you have the maximum flowers blooming. So, if you ignored those queen cups and you didn't take any corrective action by making a split or reducing the population by doing brood equalization, you'll start seeing this scenario when you pick up the frames. And the one on the left, there's two queen cells. They're cups that are active. You can see the royal jelly in there, and you can see the larvae in the lower one that's curled up. That's probably about a three-day-old larvae. And they just literally float them queens on royal jelly, and they just gorge on that stuff, and it makes what would be a normal queen, a giant queen, with full ovaries and ability to mate and all that. And then on the right-hand side is another. They're a little further along. You can see they're starting to extend the cell wall, but they're definitely full of royal jelly, and the larvae is growing as well. So when you see this, be aware when they cap that cell. You know, in two or three more days, when that cell is capped, they'll swarm with a drop of a hat. And this kind of weather, if you have an overwintered hive that's strong, and it went into this cold spell, they're in there, they're making queen cells, believe me. And when they're capped and it gets warm enough, they're going to swarm. So take corrective action when you can get out there to maintain them. By the way, how many people are new beekeepers, like keeping bees 1 or 2 years? Raise your hand. Oh, we got quite a few people that are just starting out. Okay. People that have been keeping bees for 2 or more years that are more experienced? Okay. Well, I've been doing it for over 35 years, and the weather's changing. I don't know if anybody believes in global warming, but to me, we're like 3 weeks ahead of the time, because I normally tell people this: watch the lilacs. When the lilacs bloom, that's when the bees like to swarm, so do some swarm prevention at that point. Well, the lilacs usually bloom around May, third week of May. They're blooming, they're in bud right now, ready to bloom. As soon as the sun comes out after this period, they'll be blooming. So we're several weeks ahead of the ball game. So it's all new for me. As much experience you have, it's all new for you because the weather is different. Okay, these are capped queen cells. And like I said, after they're capped, the queen will take the liberty to swarm. On my breeding nukes, I want swarming conditions so they make nice queens. So what I do is I mark my queens so I can find them easy, and I take a little tiny nail clipper and I clip one side of one wing off. So they're in my backyard. So when they swarm, she'll drop in the grass, and the swarm will come back. Well, that'll buy you a little bit of time to figure things out if you clip your queens. Sometimes if you clip them and mark them and all this manipulation with them, the bees will think something's wrong with them, and they'll try to requeen her. So it's not always the best thing to be clipping and marking and all that, but I do like to mark my queens nonetheless. So those are capped queen cells. If you see those, you can, like I said, you can put them in another nuke box, let them raise their own to have it on reserve. I've wintered bees over in 5-frame and 3-frame nuke boxes successfully. It can be done in Wisconsin. Here's some swarm prevention. I talked about some of these things, but I'll go over them. For swarm prevention, you need adequate room. Add a brood box, if you only have one brood box, or put supers on. And it's not too early to put supers on some of your hives if they've overwintered real well. And if you have drawn wax and they're wet supers, all the better. I don't like to put a queen excluder on if they're drawing foundation because they don't like to draw foundation over a queen excluder. But Chris Warner, who raises a lot of bees, he goes down to Florida and he lives in north Milwaukee. What he does to produce the maximum crop of honey is he has one brood box, puts a queen excluder on, and he puts about 5 or 6 supers on, and he produces an average of about 140 or more pounds of honey per year per colony. That's another technique. So, and the queen breeders, what they do is if you have a real strong hive and you want to equalize your population, the bees will go through an excluder to work those honey supers, and the queen won't be in there obviously, so you can take the liberty to take those bees and put them in another bee yard on top of a colony, or use them as a resource to shake them into a weak colony to help that population out. Or you can actually take brood with adhering bees and make sure your queen's not on there and put that in struggling hives. But with the struggling hive, make sure you take care of the problem, either a disease or a failing queen, along with brood equalizing. So I'll switch brood boxes around. Some people take this to the extreme and they do it too early when it's too cold, and then they put the bees on a cold floor and then they have to heat all that stuff above them. And so now would be the time to switch brood boxes. If you overwintered your bees and they're all in the top, which they usually are, you just take the top, put it on the bottom board, and put the bottom on the top. If half the bees are on the top and they're forcing the queen down, don't switch them because you're going to be separating the brood nest, and then you get a cold spell like this. They form a tight cluster, and it kind of messes things up more than it does good. So be careful when you're switching brood boxes. Equalizing brood and resources among all colonies, we talked about that. Proper ventilation. Full screen bottom boards are nice. I would definitely if you have a screen bottom board, I'd slide your solid one with this cold spell. I mean, when it gets down in the 30s at night with chances of snow, you don't want that updraft. When I make my bottom boards, I put a partial screen hole in the bottom, and that seems to work. Also, I would recommend you to put a 3/4 inch auger hole in the bottom of your handhold, about 1 inch, and that offers a lot of ventilation. And in the wintertime, when the snow's piling up, they can use that hole for ventilation. They can make a cleansing flight on a cold day. Oftentimes, I'll find like little ice crystals in the wintertime with their hot breath is getting ventilated through that little hole, and it's frosting up. So I know it's working.
Where you locate the hole?
About 1 inch below the handhold, and I put it in every brood box. Don't put it in your supers, but put it in every brood box.
Just on one side?
Just on one side, yep, the front. And then sometimes another precaution with those holes, if you buy, it's ideal to have a hole in your inner cover where the bees can also ventilate. When you put your supers on, make sure you cover that little hole, because if the bees are going through that hole, they'll put pollen in your supers, and you don't want pollen in your supers because you'll never get it out of there. And the wax moths love the pollen in your supers when you're storing them. So block your inner cover hole with duct tape or whatever when you're stacking your supers on later on, just as a warning to prevent pollen getting in there. A little bit about splitting hives. So you split the brood boxes and put the top on another bottom board, and then simply put 2 more either foundation brood boxes on the top of each one of them. And then in 2 or 3 days, you're going to look at each hive. One of them will be making queen cells because the queen's in the other unit. Then you simply requeen that hive. Buy a queen, or I recommend buying a queen, and just putting it in there and put candy in there, or put a marshmallow if it's one of those type of queen cages, and do a relatively slow release.
When you go to split?
When do you split?
No, when you go to split.
Okay.
When is too soon to put the new queen in, and when is it too late to put the new queen in?
If you want to go through the work of finding a queen with a 2-story crowded hive, it's kind of a challenge. I wouldn't use a lot of smoke because she likes to run and hide in the corner. It's ideal to find her, to put that other brood box on another foundation.
Well, what I've done is put a queen excluder.
That's an excellent idea.
Below where I think she's laying above. And then when I get ready to split, I'll see where there are no eggs. That's when I'll put the queen in, but I question is, when I physically split them, when is it too early to put the queen in? Or when is it
I would
too late?
wait at least a day, because then the pheromones will go away. Within hours, the pheromones will be diminished from that queen, but within a day, you're sure that they're gone, and so you can safely put it in at that point. That's an excellent idea, by the way, putting the excluder between the bodies, and then you'll find out which one has the new fresh eggs. It takes 3 days for the egg to hatch, so after the 4th or 5th day, you can go ahead and find out which unit has the queen in it. And then if you don't have out yards, meaning a bee yard 3 or 4 miles away to put the split, and you're going to be putting it right next to your other hive, all the field bees will fly out and migrate back to the parent hive, depopulating that split. So what I'd recommend you to do is get frames that are populated with nurse bees. Nurse bees are secreting royal jelly, and they're usually on the frames with egg and developing brood, and shake like 3 or 4 of those of the adhering bees into that new unit, because those bees are young and naive. They haven't made their little orientation flights yet, so they'll stay with that split hive and help keep that population right, so they can keep everything warm, and you want your hives to be relatively equal. When we have a dearth period setting in or whatever, they'll tend to rob the weak hives out, and once you start robbing fever, it spreads through the whole yard and it can be a mess. So it's really important to keep your hives equalized by splitting or by putting brood from one to the next or whatever. Keep them relatively equally building up. So yeah, we already covered that number 3. Old field bees will fly back to the parent hive, so shake 3 frames of nurse bees into the hive that's being moved. This is the dynamics of making a little nuke box up. These are nice little wooden nuke boxes, or some. When I sell nukes, I sell a limited number of nukes in the springtime. I use those really nice ones from their corrugated poly. They're really a nice nuke box. In fact, I drill a little hole in the top where I can fit a feed can can fit on the top if they're in waiting, or it's just nice to have a little feed hole. And then I just put a large canning cover over it with duct tape when it's not being used for feeding. So anyway, you can see what it says here. It says honey and nectar in the far end, drawn comb for foundation next to that, open or sealed brood in the middle, open or sealed brood next to that, and then pollen or pollen and honey mix on the end. And after you put your split in there, if you're going to let them raise their own queen, you're going to have to wait a long time. It's best not to disturb them bees when they're in the process of raising a queen. If the queen's young and she hasn't bred yet, they don't recognize her as a laying queen yet. They can what's called balling her, and they'll form a little literal ball of bees around her, pull on her legs and suffocate her if you bother them too much when they're in the process of mating. So when they talk about now brood equalizing, this is a perfect frame to brood equalize. It's going to decrease the population from the colony you're taking it from, and it'll increase the one that's struggling, because a frame like this, when it's got brood on both sides like that, when the bees hatch out, those babies will occupy 3 more frames. So you can see that this exponential reproduction on the bees when you got all these frames of bees hatching. And now, we're kind of, I haven't been in my bees, well, I was in my bees today getting stung like crazy because they were angry because of the weather, but I had to do it because my timing with the queen breeding is I had to start a lot of queens this afternoon. But for my out yards, I haven't been messing with them because it's been so cold. So I'm going to be in for a surprise when I go back to see them, because they don't wait for the weather. They'll hatch in any kind of weather in the hive. So be vigilant with your bees. Check them every 7 to 10 days, and sometimes it's just pulling the inner cover off and doing a visual check. If you're starting with a package or a nuke, and the bees are out to the end frames, definitely get another brood box on them, or supers, or whatever your technique is, so they can have that room to expand. So the last part of it here, if you fail to do everything right and you get in your bee swarm, there's a little technique with catching swarms too. They'll often land, they'll form a little ball, quite a good nice ball in a tree next to the hive, probably within 10 feet usually. and then they send scout bees out from that cluster of bees. And if you don't catch them within a couple of hours, or they can stay there a day or two, the whole swarm will leave and follow the scout bees to a hollow of a log or a hollow of a building or something like that to form a new nest. Shaking a swarm isn't hard. They're usually full of honey, so they're pretty docile. They're not prone to sting you. You just set your box underneath the hive, give it a good shake, and the bees will fall in there. And if the queen goes in there, they'll open their little scent glands, and they'll all march in there. It's quite amazing and dramatic to watch. With swarms, what I do to help keep the swarms intact, sometimes they won't like the smell, or they won't like the hive for whatever reason, and they'll fly out within a couple hours after you've hived them, even if you get the queen in there. What I do is I take a few moments and I go to an established hive and I pull a frame of milk brood, which means larvae that they're feeding royal jelly to. It'll have a little white milky appearance. I put that frame right in the middle of the swarm collecting box, and then when I shake the bees in there, it's like a little magnet. They really love that brood, and they'll usually stay inside the swarm will stay put if you entice them with that brood. Here's some examples of swarms. I've already had one of my hives swarmed. I was so busy getting packages together and helping people install their bees and everything, I was ignoring my own bees. And the farmer called and said there's a big bee swarm in the apple tree and a branch, and there sure was. It was huge. It was a huge swarm. And I only had a nuke box with me, a 5-frame corrugated nuke box. And so I thought I'd shake them into there, and they didn't all fit. And so I just took a chance, and I put them in there, and I ran to help this other lady install her bees. And he called up. He said, "Well, they all flew out of that box and landed back on the tree, even with the enticing brood that I had in there." so I had to go back and get a regular standard 10-frame Langstroth hive with a bottom board, and just like you see on the right side, and I shook them in there, and they stayed put. So my hives split, and I have a nice hive. The unit that swarmed had queen cells, and what I did is I just destroyed the queen cells, which I told you not to do. But the reason why I did that is that I put a nuke in there with a good queen that has good breeding, and so that they'll both be in perfect condition to produce a nice honey crop. So that about ends my presentation of the queens. There's a lot more I can talk to. So thank you, and any questions that we have on anything? The queens, it's quite a, I guess we could probably power down on this. Yeah, I covered a lot, and it's quite a lot to comprehend. Yes? Question over
So
here?
what is your opinion of that idea of using one brood box, queen excluder, and then supers?
I love that idea, and I've tried it with success.
Really?
I love that idea.
Then why
Yeah.
doesn't everybody do that? And is there then enough honey for winter?
Well, there
Having
won't be
just
any honey for
one-
winter. There won't be any honey at all, and that's the joy of doing it this way, because if you visualize your 2 brood boxes about
Yeah.
that deep, what there will be is there'll be like a concentric line of honey going down like this, and then a band of pollen, and then there'll be like maybe four frames of brood on the top and 5 frames of brood on the bottom, and everything else will be honey and pollen bound. When you do it this way, there'll be brood basically from one end to the next on the bottom box eventually, when they pull all that honey and bring it upstairs into your supers. And so you'll have 10 frames of brood, which is equivalent of having 2 brood
Yeah.
boxes.
Okay,
But there will be no honey in there.
right.
And Russians, they think different. They said, starve your bees of honey, put supers on, and they will fill the supers up really quickly
With honey.
with honey.
But then
That's
what do
you
they do in the winter?
Okay, this is
Florida.
yeah, that's just what he does. Chris
Oh,
Warner
is that
goes
what
to
he
Florida
does?
with these hives, and then they start getting nectar from there. But and I've done this, and it's very successful. Okay, instead of putting your last super on, put a
Yeah.
brood box on instead.
Oh, at the top?
Yeah, put a brood box on, preferably
Oh.
with comb. If you don't have comb, well, if your honey's all capped, take it as soon as you can. You don't want to get travel stain. You might as well take it and extract it
Right.
while it's warm. And then you could just put that brood box pull your excluder, put that brood box on, and let them draw that comb out and feed them. Because usually what I've been learning is that in August, we usually have a dearth period. The grass is drying out, the honey's dried out, there's not much going on, the bees will start robbing each other. I feed them 2 gallons of syrup, and they can take 2 gallons of syrup in 5 to 8 days.
You're doing that in August?
I'm doing that in August, and I'm feeding them pollen patties. And you want fat, sassy bees. They got this little fat bodies. The winter bees do. They're different than summer bees. So I'm trying to fatten them up for winter. And then I want that second brood box full of honey.
Right. Okay, and then you just put that on top of
You can also just, well, you don't want them to swarm because you maybe have 5 or 6 supers on, and you have one brood box. When you put your bee go on or whatever, you're forcing all those bees down into one box, and they'll swarm in a drop of a hat.
Yeah.
So that's why you got to put your other brood box on there and then feed them. If you're drawing comb, they'll draw a comb really nice that time of year. It's warm. There's a lot of bees the right age to draw a comb.
So what do? You put I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing. You've got 5 supers, and then you put a brood box on top of that.
You can do it that way if you have drawing comb. Well, if they have to finish drawing out the supers.
But you've got to get the bees out of there.
If the well, you just pull that brood box off with the adhering bees, set it down, put your bee go on, draw all the bees down, then put it back on. I'm just saying it depends if there's a huge honey flow going on
Oh, I see. There'll be some up in that top brood box.
Well, yeah.
That you don't have to worry about, and then you can force them down.
That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to force them all down, take your honey and run.
Yeah.
Put the brood box, second brood box on there after you take the excluder off, and then let the queen have free reign. And then pack that top box with nectar. But watch for swarming. I mean, it's they can swarm too. So
you're not going to swarm in a couple hours.
Oh no. But that's one thing that Chrissy watches for swarms when you're in one box.
So you're then extracting in like early August.
I extract in July. As soon as the honey's capped, I extract 2 times, July and then in August, and then I'm done. And then, because there's nothing much happening. And then the fall honey, if there's a fall flow, then it's all let them have it. Let them have the goldenrod and all that. It's dark honey anyway, and it's got a strong flavor. Some people like it, but I let the bees have it. Question over here?
Is there a difference in queen excluders? I bought one from Fleet and Farm, and it's a plastic kind. And I read online that those kind can shred the wings of the bees, and that the ones from Dodont are metal and they're better and gentler.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
true.
Okay.
But like Man Lake now, they're molding them instead of stamping them, so they've got smooth corners too, and they're gray and they're just, I know the bees seem to use them okay. And I found out something too. I've been keeping bees for 35 years. I didn't know this. They have a wire queen excluder cleaner that you just run along it, and it automatically cleans all that burr and bridge comb off it, and it makes it really an easy chore to do. Some people burn it off, and then it burns off your galvanization, and it can rust. So I don't know if the burning is such a good idea. Yeah.
I'm sorry if this is stupid. Burr comb, is that only above and below, or is that also on the hive? Like in my hive, the frames are kind of sometimes sealed together by comb. Is that burr comb too?
That's burr comb. Burr comb. Some people call it bridge comb. It's like a bridge where they can get from one end to the next. We were talking earlier, and if you put your queen cage in between 2 frames, and it's just foundation, they can actually put a third comb in there because you're defying the bee pinch. If you defy the bee space, they'll put burr comb or bridge comb in there. So always, after you take that queen cage out, push those frames together and put equal distance on each end, and keep the shoulders touching each other. Now that's in your brood boxes. In your supers, after your first year, you have 10 frames in your super, and they've drawn that wax out. You extracted it. The next year, put 9 frames in there, because then it'll belly out, and when you take your knife to cut it off, it'll be a nice smooth cut, and you won't have that indentation to have to pick like you did when you had 10 frames in your supers when you first started out. So it's always important. And they make little gapping tools. They're self gappers where you can just push that. It's got like little pokers, and you poke them in there, and it automatically gaps to 9 frames. Or you can just do it with your eye if you have a few hives. Question in the back?
Yeah, the frames that are full of pollen, what do you do with those?
If
They're
they're,
just chock full of pollen, that's all that's on frame.
if they're pollen bound,
Yeah.
oh man. Well, they found that pollen doesn't store very well. Like within a year, it loses like 80% of its nutritional value. So I don't know. I don't know what to do with it.
Would you remove it from that hive and put an empty frame in there
Yeah,
in order to
yeah, you
rectify the
could.
condition?
Yeah, you could, but or move it to the ends, you know, or you want to free the brood nest. You want to free that brood nest.
You get too many of them.
Too many pollen frames filled up?
Yeah.
Yeah, the queen should be laying eggs and keeping ahead of that pollen, but when you have weather like this, for like a week of rain and when they can't get out, they'll actually eat that pollen and make room for the queen to expand laterally. So don't get too discouraged if you think you're pollen bound and then you get a week of like this, you might not be so pollen bound when you look at them next. Question back?
One of the things they've done is sorting out maybe the frames. Some hives you'll get 4 full frames of pollen, all nice and glistening and good pollen. And we'll just take most of those out and we'll leave one on either side, just inside the honey frames. So they got one frame just on the outside of the brood. So we just scatter them out because some hives won't have much pollen at all, so we equalize that way.
That's a great idea. Yep. Just swap frames. Yeah.
I did that with a bunch of packages this year. We put honey in there, and pollen, and then some drawn brood, and occasionally we do throw in some foundation. And I'm we're walking past the hives one day, and I'm seeing all these pollen pockets out on the ground.
Huh.
The bees were actually cleaning out the pollen. Didn't look that bad, but they were cleaning it
Yeah,
out.
if it's old and it's lost its nutritional value, they'll pull it out as a waste product
Yep.
and open that cell up. Yeah. A little bit about foundation I was going to talk to you about. Foundation comes in a lot of different sizes, believe it or not, and they measure it in millimeter. Some guy from Dayton, so a long time ago, came up with the idea that if we build a bigger foundation, we'll produce a bigger bee, and they'll have a bigger stomach, and we can get more honey. Well, it was kind of logical, but it wasn't a very good idea because it's really not what the bees prefer. And so there's another size. That's 5.4 millimeters. Is that what the data come up with? It was a very popular size for many years. Well, now with the mites, they're finding that the mites, when you use a 5.4, it's cooler. It's a cooler temperature in the brood nest, and the mites prefer that cooler temperature. But they also have another size. It's 4.9 millimeters, and that's called small cell. And you need small cell bees to draw that wax. Otherwise, they'll make a mess out of it. They'll do transition combs, and some of it will be grown, and it'll be a mess. So anyway, I'm kind of steering away from the large and the small because I tried that 4.9 and it's frustrating to work with. So the best size that I found is 5.1, and Man Lake makes 5.1. That's all the foundation that they'll roll is 5.1, because they've done some experiments with feral colonies that drew wild comb, and they measured the average size of the cell, and they find that it's 5.1. So a lot of the plasticell you'll buy is 5.1, and all, like I said, all the rolled from Man Lake is 5.1. It's a preferred size. So that's just a little side note on foundation.
You said on making splits, you add a queen. You're providing your own queens. If we're looking for a hardy northern queen supplier, where can we find something like that?
Well, I do that. That's what I do. I've been doing it for many, many years, raising queens that are northern high. There's actually a North Queen Breeders Association. We're kind of like a tight, closed group, and we share genetic stock with each other. And I just helped my friend Johnny pull a feral hive that's been there for, they say 15 years. I don't know how many years that hive's been under, but it's under a corn crib under the planks. So we got a shot back, we vacuumed them, and we wired we strung the comb and blank frames, and we went through a lot of work, but we got the queen. We saved the queen, and she's laying, and that's what I grafted this morning, or this afternoon. I grafted from that hardy stock. I call them survivors. And some of the workers were yellow, some of them were black, like the Carniolan. What I noticed is that the Carniolans are usually the survivors. They have a different habit. A little bit about the bee races of bees. The main ones you buy in a package are either Italian or Carniolan. Italians are nice; they'll produce a nice honey crop. But in Italy, they have an 8-month summer and a mild little winter for a couple months. There's hardly any kind of winter to speak of. Well, that's not what we have. You know, as we know, we have a long, drawn-out winter, cold springs like this, and the Carniolan bees are from the Karnaca Mountains, which are in Russia, in the Russian, it borders Russian and some other country. But that climate in the mountains is more severe than our climate. It's cold, it's nasty, it's rainy, it's snowy, it's inclement weather, and then they got a mild little couple of months for summer. And that bee has evolved to live in that climate, and that's why I like the Carniolans. They're the nice survivors. You know, they're usually black. They can come in different colors, but they're usually a darker kind of a bee. But I'm training other beekeepers to do the same thing because I can't keep up with the demand. There's so much demand for queens and packages and things that I wish more people that are advanced beekeepers or would like to take this on would do some queen breeding and raise these, because there's such a demand for queens that are hardy that'll live in our climate.
So you're doing all grafting?
I do all grafting, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I grafted
And when are
about
your
80
queens
queens
going to be
today.
available?
May 12th. I'm going to have the second harvest. But the first harvest sold out within like 2 days. It was sold out in the first batch. But Andy's learning how to do it too. Yeah. Question?
How do the queens get fertilized when you raise them? What do you do? Just let them out the back door and then they come back?
Yeah, I don't do any artificial insemination or anything like that. I looked into it and I thought, you know, nature knows more than I do with what's the better drone. And so a little bit about biology of queen breeding. When the queen is about 5 or 6 days old, weather permitting, she will fly out into what's called a drone congregational area. And drones for miles around, they'll, 5, 10 miles around, will find these geographic